Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you so much for joining this charity digital webinar. My name is Nick Wyatt and I shall be your host for today, where we'll be focusing our attention on how to measure your charity's fundraising activity. So here we are, and this all starts by looking at data. Most of us have it, but how can we effectively use it? And more importantly for today, how can we use it to improve fundraising performance? Many of us have probably already sat on a lot of data that can be hugely useful when used properly, but how do you decipher what is useful and what is not? How do we benchmark and how do we know what to measure? The possibilities are endless, and choosing your key performance indicators can be an absolute nightmare. Fundraising plays such a huge role in many charities' operations. Many of us can use all the help we can get, so really nailing this down will be hugely beneficial. Luckily, we are joined today by Andrew and Rob from Wood for Trees, who are here to help us all. They will be taking us through the key metrics, types of data, and as the title suggests, showing us how to measure fundraising activity and so much more. Now, before I begin and hand over to them, I just want to go over a few house rules. Firstly, there's a Q&A at the end of the presentation, so make sure to get your questions in now, or not now, during the presentation, and also make sure to update your favorites so that they have the best chances of being answered. Also, if there's one of either Rob or Andrew that you want to ask in particular, please just let us know and we'll do so. This session is being recorded and the slides will be sent out at some point over the next week. So we'll also upload a version of it onto we'll upload a version of it onto YouTube soon after. So keep an eye out if you need a recap. So hello, Andrew and hello, Rob. How are we today?
Very well, thanks, Nick.
Right, I'll leave you guys to it.
Great, thank you, Nick. Hi, welcome to everyone watching, wherever you're joining us from. I hope you'll find the session useful today. The session is called How to Measure Your Charity's Fundraising Activity, in which we're going to be looking at what to track and why. Before we get into that, a little bit about us. So my name's Rob. I'm going to be discussing a range of measures with you today over the course of this and looking at why you might want to track some things over others and making some recommendations on how to go about measuring your charity's results. And I'm sharing hosting duties today with Andrew Sargent, who's our Director of Analysis at Wood for Trees, and I'll hand over to him in just a moment. But Andrew and I both work on analysis and insight projects for Wood for Trees, and we've amassed a total of 15 years experience in doing so. And if you don't know us as a company, Wood for Trees are an agency who work with charities and membership organisations across the UK and overseas, for that matter, on data and insight. We're both West Country boys, so Andrew is originally from Dorset. I grew up in Cornwall myself. We're both keen on getting out and about on our bikes, as are pretty much everyone else that lives in Bath, which is where we're based. And we both share a love of football as well. We both support teams from close to where we grew up. Although if push comes to shove, you'll probably find us cheering on Tottenham Hotspur, but don't let that put you off us. That's a little bit about us. I'll hand over now to Andrew.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, I should say what we disagree on. So when it comes to tea or coffee, Rob and I will often go for a coffee and he'll order a tea, which always baffles me. So each their own. And bringing this back slightly to data and what we're here to talk about, he's more of a Power BI man than Tableau, which is my preferred data visualization tool for all those that are wondering. Do feel free to put your own preferences in the chat. You can either support my coffee addiction or opt for a secret option number 3 of Excel for your preferred way of visualizing data. So yeah, do use that chat to introduce yourselves and tell us what you enjoy. What we're going to cover today then is, as Nick said, unpicking the world of sort of KPIs and what do they mean, how do you choose them. We'll go on to think about some best practice sort of tips for reporting on them and choosing them. And then finally, we've got some ideas about how to present them. So often a barrier to engaging with KPIs is how you visualize them and how people understand them. So we'll discuss a few ways to sort of bring that sort of KPI reporting alive at the end. So what is a KPI? We keep saying this acronym KPI stands for a key performance indicator. So it's a measure of something that's important to what you're doing. It's some part of your charity that tells you something key. And that word key, the first bit, the K, that's the really sort of standout bit. And this isn't going to be a webinar that says these are the 10 things that you must measure. Our first bit of advice is don't just report on what everybody else is reporting on. What matters to you will be different to everybody, other people. What matters should definitely be measured. So again, bear that in front of mind. Also, not everything that can be measured matters, and that's another really important thing to remember. We worked with a charity a couple of years ago, a big national charity, and they had this KPI report. I can't even remember. I think they were moving it from either they were moving databases or moving the way they reported on it, but they wanted us to help them recreate it. And we looked at it, and there was hundreds of KPIs in there. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little for a webinar, but there were just so many that all these measures just lost any meaning just because there were so many. So a real good reminder that just because you can find a number of something doesn't mean you have to show it. This, hopefully, what we'll talk through today will really help people focus on what do we mean by key, and how can we really relate it to what each organization does to make it useful. The other thing to think about is who they're for. So they're usable across an organization, both for SLT and boards, so that they understand how the fundraising teams are doing, how the charity is performing, to essentially fulfill the services that they're there to provide. That's the key part there. Also for fundraising teams, so that they can check how the activity is doing, so they can pivot more tactically into better areas or stop things that aren't working, and that sort of thing. So they're useful both at that sort of tactical and that strategic level, and they might sometimes be different, but what we'll talk about today, these core KPIs should be able to be used for both those things. Another thing to think about is what they're useful for, and that's that they can be a really good and great first step in using data more. These are a couple of figures from a report that a company called Data Orchard ran. I think it was last year. Their state of data maturity across the UK sort of charity sector. And a couple of worrying facts there, certainly from our point of view. 63% of organisations said that their charity leaders weren't convinced in the value of data. And only 36% said they were comfortable using data internally to ask sort of difficult questions, which is really what KPIs should be doing. You should have that measure to really challenge, is this working? Is it not working? Are we doing a good job? So KPI is a really good first step to get that 36% up to at least 50%, 60%, 70% where organizations should be. So as I said right at the beginning, this isn't a webinar that says, right, these are the 10 KPIs you must report on. But we do think there are certain areas, certain things that KPIs should relate to. We've put them into these sort of 5 buckets. So volume, value, journey, contactability, and then we've given ourselves a bit of a get out of jail wildcards if what we don't cover is right for you, but we'll come on to that at the end. And we think you can probably choose 1 or 2 from each of these boxes to come up with a really nice starting point for KPI reporting. So first one, volume, and by this we're talking about sort of supporter volume. I think, just remembered, a poll should pop up in a minute just to get your views on what you think is a good KPI when we're talking about volume. I'm just going to run through a few options and sort of some of the pros and cons and challenges with each of these sort of performance indicators and whether they are key or not. The first one there on that list is active file size. I think that's a really great one. Gives you a good sense of how many supporters you have at any one time. The big challenge with it, though, is often around definitions. So what do we mean by active? Regular givers, that can be easy, they're active or they're not. For ad hoc givers, do we mean people that have given in the last year, the last 2 years, the last 3 years? think if that's a KPI that an organization takes on, the key thing is to clearly define it and to have that definition used across the charity. It's nothing worse than one team using one active definition and another team using a completely different one. So that results are different, numbers are different, no one's really on the same page. So I think that's a really sort of important thing. Others slightly potentially simpler things like new recruits. Useful to know how many new supporters you're getting each month or each year. Again, one of the challenges with that can be around definitions. So acquisition campaigns that say you brought in 200 supporters is great, but if 100 of those are already known to you, already on your database, then are they truly new? So again, the thing about definitions is key throughout all of this, and we'll certainly come back to that when we talk about some best practice tips. On the right hand side there, we've got things like lapsed supporters and churn, the churn of supporters that you see. And again, for some organizations where they know that's a problem, where it's a strategy to stem that attrition, that can be really a useful measure. But for others, really established charities that have historically low churn and don't have a problem with the number of people that sort of tick over, is that really a key performance indicator that needs to be measured and monitored? I'm not sure. I haven't seen a poll, but I'm gonna assume that you all said active file size because it's my thing. The second area is value. Again, we've got something like net income, which I think is really great. Essentially, it's surely the most important thing for any fundraising team, the amount of money that is going to the cause. I think the big challenge, the big problem with that as a KPI is how do you get that cost information? That isn't often held on databases. It's very difficult to do consistently across teams. The way fundraising works, the way finance works, often a bit different, and reconciling those quickly is really challenging. So often, actually, something like gross income, so just knowing how much money is being brought in, that's a better KPI because it's quicker to get. You can have more confidence in it. You can be more flexible with how it's reported. Other sort of value measures like lifetime value are really great, but as a monthly, as a quarterly KPI, again, can have their drawbacks. Obviously, hugely important to know how much a supporter has given you over their lifetime, but should that be used more as an insight measure rather than knowing the lifetime value of our file at this point of time is X or Y? Because that can be really skewed if you do lots of recruitment. The people that don't have very long lifetime to give brings that down, or vice versa. Got a big old traditional file where everyone's been given a long time and a much higher lifetime. This one we have got a poll, which is great. So ROI got quite a few votes, which I think, yeah, hugely important to know the success of things. Again, same problems with net income, making sure that costs are consistent. How do you make sure they're on a database? How do you make sure you reconcile that quickly enough to be used as a KPI? Often, if you just know roughly how much things are costing you, having those sort of gross income measures can be enough to know whether something's working. And I'm glad not very many people said average gift, because that's my least favorite of all KPIs, I think. This idea that getting a higher average gift from the last appeal we did, or as supporters are giving more on average, is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? We can push average gift up just by asking for more. But what does that mean then to our response rates, to the number of people that are actually engaging with us and that sort of thing? So I think it's one that's quite flawed. One I didn't put on here was engagement, becoming more and more important when we talk about sort of fundraising and more fundraising teams becoming engagement teams and things like that. Again, a really powerful KPI because it can bring in lots of different sort of interactions beyond just donations. Again, the challenge with that is setting up that engagement score, and there's work there to do that. But if you've got it, again, it could be a powerful KPI.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, the next section that we're looking at is journey then, which I think is a really interesting area actually, and there'll be another poll for this popping up in just a second. So being able to tell or at least infer what a supporter's done since they started supporting the charity can be a really powerful thing. If we know where they're at in their life cycle or their supporter journey, if you like, then we can tailor the things that we're putting in front of them accordingly. And all of this comes back to the sort of age-old marketing principles of the right message for the right person at the right time, creating a positive supporter experience, all those kind of big things that we know we should be doing and trying to do at every point. So on our list here, we've got some interesting ones here. So top of the list there is cross-sell. I've got a feeling we've got poll 3 up and we need poll 4 actually. So I don't know if you can tweak that for us, possibly just so that it matches up with the slides. Sorry, I think that's our bad. Cross-sell, top of the list there. Really useful to see what someone's done. But what we don't necessarily know from this metric in isolation is what impact that's had when they've moved from one product onto another. Has it stopped them donating to that first product they were donating to and only donating to the second one? Are they still donating to both but at lower value than they were donating before? Is the thing that they're doing now more suitable for them? Is it just that it's been put in front of them and it's kind of a coincidental thing because of some communications that have been sent out to them? It can be really useful, but I think there are quite a lot of questions that remain unanswered by it when we take it in isolation. So although it's undoubtedly a useful thing to know, it's perhaps just a bit of a starting point for us, really. What could perhaps be a bit more useful to us in a lot of cases, and one thing that I'm a bit more keen on myself would be something like second gift rate. So if a new donor has given to us only once, as nearly 70% of supporters do, according to some sources, then you're often left with a loss on that initial investment to gain the donor in the first place. And so the true benefit of getting someone on board comes when they're retained over a longer term. And so second gift rate can tell us fairly quickly, in a lot of cases, who's of most interest to us and who's worth devoting our time to. And I think second gift rate's a good one as well, because it can indicate that other things are being done quite well that go back to those fairly fundamental principles that we mentioned at the start there. So things like thanking supporters fairly quickly after their first donation, or segmenting and personalizing communications to them pretty well. And interesting that on the poll, actually, second gift rate has come out on top just over product engagements, which we'll come to in a sec. We've got on the list as well lifetime value, which was on the previous slide, and there are some issues with that, as Andrew mentioned just now. We get asked about LTV calculations a lot, and there's quite a nice quote, I think, that goes with LTV, that where the smallest deed is better than the grandest intention. And so although we kind of naturally assume that the higher the LTV, the better, and undoubtedly that is, in some cases, absolutely right, the fact that someone's giving at all is perhaps more useful to us than someone not giving to us. So it's certainly a useful metric. It gives us an idea of the value of an individual or group to the charity, which is great. And also implicitly gives us a bit of a steer on what might be a reasonable cost to acquire more of those supporters from similar sources. But there's a lot of assumptions that we have to carry with the calculations that we make with that, and that future supporters are going to be treated in the same way as previous supporters in order to make those projections valid. So I think something that I'd be keen to emphasize with something like lifetime value is that maybe we need to time restrict it, and something like 3 or 5 year lifetime value after someone started supporting is perhaps more appropriate. We've also got monthly attrition rates on there, so getting more into things like regular giving. Having worked pretty hard to acquire our new donors, as we talked about on the volume slides a couple of slides ago, spreading the word about the charity's cause, you probably want to be investing your time in nurturing those relationships and if at all possible, not just starting from scratch all the time. So as well as having donations coming in from retaining those supporters, making a big difference to the value that you're seeing, there's also the potential there, the longer a relationship goes on, for things like legacy gifts or major donor type donations. So although attrition rates aren't, strictly speaking, a value KPI, they can be really useful. A monthly attrition rate can make a massive impact on how much you need to spend on things like acquisition. And also it can impact your income, of course, and strategically on things like stewardship, all sorts of decisions tied into this. And monthly attrition rates will primarily affect what you're tactically doing in the short term, but they also lay the groundwork for things like annual attrition rates, which is a bit more of a macro measure. So your annual attrition rate can be really important for long-term strategic decisions, and you might be looking forward 3, 5, 10 years. So depending on what your plans are for those years ahead, you're probably looking at having as big a pool of supporters as possible to pick and choose from and send different things to. And this is where your annual attrition rate is probably more used to you than the monthly rate. So if you can assume you've got a certain number of supporters in, say, 3 years' time, you can choose what you're going to do with them and factor in acquisition and retention for those future years as well. And the higher your attrition rate, of course, the more prospects you'll have for things like large-scale campaigns, stewarding major gifts from them. You'll probably know a bit more about them than someone that's brand new to the charity. And so you can depend on those supporters in a different way to newly acquired supporters who might be a bit less predictable. We've also got on the list here upgrades. So can be a really good indication of someone that's committed to the charity. They've increased the value that they're giving to you, but it can potentially indicate who's been asked as well. Has everyone been asked? Has someone chosen not to upgrade their donation? You never know if you haven't really asked them to do it, and I don't think we should be afraid of asking supporters to do so. We've also got to factor in how much value they were giving to us in the first place. So an upgrade from, say, £50 per month to £100 per month is a very different proposition to upgrading from £5 a month to £10 a month. So even though they're both upgrades and they've both doubled their gift, you're probably going to be doing different things with them. But that said, upgrades and downgrades, for that matter, it can tell us something about what a supporter is thinking in terms of their commitment to the charity. So an upgraded supporter has probably recognised there's an increased need for their support, and perhaps even more importantly, they've shown you that they're prepared to help out with that in the face of their own costs going up, because Lord knows they only ever go up, right? So, in fact, that upgrade might have provided you with some updated information as well, so new bank details, a new address perhaps, all those sorts of things. And this helps you with your revenue, of course, but it also helps you with enriching your data and keeping someone engaged in future as well. So potentially quite a wide-ranging implication to things like that. Product engagements. Rated pretty highly in the poll as well just now. So we're talking about the number of gifts or products donated to by a supporter. And again, this could potentially indicate that a supporter's been around for a long period of time and done various different things. Again, it could be just that they've been asked to do lots of things and gone about it that way as well. So some interesting things to think about when it comes to the journey metrics. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you very much. I think this is going back to poll number 3. I think we've put them out of order. Apologies for that. So in terms of contactability then, I think a lot of these are probably fairly self-explanatory, but one that might be worth just discussing a moment is data hygiene, which might be a bit of a confusing term to some of you on the call. What we're talking about here is what data do we have and how useful is it? So for example, are we missing data in key fields like email addresses, postal addresses, postcodes, all those sorts of things that we ideally want? And have we verified that data as well? So things like PAF checks on postcodes so that we know they're accurate and the Royal Mail will deliver to that address. They recognise that address as being valid. Verification of email addresses as well is something that can trip people up quite a lot. So are we missing an @ sign or a dot in our email address? Do we have lots of Mickey Mouse at whatever .coms there that we don't think are all that useful to us? So it's definitely something that charities should be doing periodically, and making sure their data is as clean as possible, because the cleaner your data is, the more things you can do with it. But tracking data hygiene ongoing can be indicative of some limitations that might have been there in collecting that data in the first place. So be it a face-to-face agency that's not necessarily taken as much care as they could have in getting all the details down correctly, or limitations with a web form, all those sorts of things. Interestingly, the opt-in rate has come out streets ahead of all the others, so that's an interesting one. Whether data hygiene is good or bad, I think we probably just consider it a bit of a starting point for everything else here. So the rest of them fairly self-explanatory. Opt-in rate, I think, is a really good one to be looking at. So a really good sign of engagement, depending on how it's been served to the supporter. Have they had to opt in order to have something else happen as part of their donation? Have they been sort of automatically opted in, perhaps? Were they likely to have read what was in, say, a privacy policy or something? So it's an interesting one, but I think probably worth just thinking about a little bit carefully in terms of what has actually happened to get that opt-in in the first place. Also, I guess the other thing to think about with that is that a high level, or rather a high level opt-in rate of, say, 50% might mean one thing to some fundraising teams, but not to others. So, for example, you might have opted into direct mail in general, but you don't wish to receive newsletters or cash appeals or something like that. So I think there's still something to be said here for horses for courses a little bit. The last thing I suppose to talk about really on this list of KPIs is, who are we really interested in? Are we applying these contactability metrics to the whole database, the whole supporter base, or are we just interested in those that are newly acquired or those that are actively donating at the moment? I think that's probably the really key thing that I'd reiterate when choosing any kind of metric in terms of contactability. Who is it you're really wanting to contact, and what are you looking to do with them when you do so? So I'll hand back to Andrew now.
Thanks, Rob. It's very stressful making these slides work in time. I think I'm just about managing it. So the wild card, this is, as I said, our sort of get out of jail card. If you think, well, this is really important to us, but you've not mentioned it. These are the things that are specific to certain organizations, but not others. And we included a few examples of what we mean by that. And the first one being Cancer Research UK. So you might have seen last month, they released their new organizational strategy. And in it, there's a couple of references to fundraising. And they talk about becoming more environmentally sustainable. That's one of the big sort of strategic drivers for their fundraising, which is really interesting. Certainly taps into the way the world is. But how, if that's a strategic goal, how are they going to measure it? It needs to be a KPI if you're going to track performance against it, and if that's something you want to change. So what's that going to look like? Is that about measuring the carbon footprint of different activities and reporting on that? Whatever it looks like, it becomes a KPI which is specific to the strategic goals of that organization, and links those things together, which is really powerful. But obviously not easy. Another example, we've got RNLI, who are hugely reliant on legacies. Therefore, it would make complete sense to have a KPI specific to legacy giving, whether that's legacy income or something more specific to the legacy pipeline, whether that's legacy inquirers, new legacy pledges, that sort of thing. And then finally, Laura Lynn, they're a smaller charity in Ireland that we work with, and they do a lot of corporate fundraising, relying on that as a big income stream. So having a KPI that reports on that sort of corporate income they're getting in, corporate partners, that's something that for them would be really important to measure and to monitor and to track. And that links us quite nicely into the first of sort of these best practice tips for setting up key performance indicators. They really should link to what each organization's strategy is. As I said right up front, this isn't, here's the 10 KPIs you should have. This is don't just copy what everyone else has. There are some which obviously make sense for more people, but really make them relevant to what you're trying to achieve, what your program looks like, and where the sort of the challenges are. The second sort of key thing is to define them really well, so that people are aware of what it means. Back to that, the point we made earlier about the active file, or what's our definition for that, how is that calculated? And I think even if you're unsure of your data, you're not quite, maybe you're not 100% confident in how accurate it is at times, if at least you can get a consistent definition and report on it in the same way over a long period of time, that consistency will at least give you a benchmark, give you something to track against, bearing with some caveats, but having that consistency over that accuracy can often win out. Thirdly is segmenting those KPIs. Sometimes it might be more useful to see some of the things we've talked about by different groups. Churn, for example, if that's something that could be looked at, but for different types of supporters, people that have been on file a long time, what's their churn versus people that are quite new, or what's their active file as regular givers versus their ad hoc donors. So some level of segmentation could be really powerful again with KPIs. Targets is always a good thing to set some context around what a KPI is showing. So just knowing that your I don't know, your LTV is £50, well, is that good or is that bad? What are we trying to achieve? Similarly with trends, like our opt-in rate is currently 50% for new recruits this month. Well, is that up or is that down compared to last month, last year, that sort of thing? So again, targets and trends can really help put things in context and make these KPIs more meaningful to everyone that's looking at them. Finally, being able to benchmark against similar organizations or people with similar programs can be really powerful. Again, we've got to be really careful with benchmarks, just knowing that the opt-in rate across the sector is 20%. Well, that's interesting, but if the sector is using channels which are completely different to the channels that you're using, well then that's not going to be a useful sort of contextual piece of information. But having benchmarks across similar organizations and knowing what could be achieved can be really powerful to put alongside your KPIs. So to bring some of that to life and to illustrate what we mean, we have come up with our own couple of charities. So mine is a well-established environmental charity. We've got a large regular giving program, very little digital income, but this year because everyone is invested quite heavily in Facebook events and fundraising. So what would I choose? I'm going to measure an active file size and include a sort of trend on that. And you can see to the right of this slide, this is a view of charities that use our Insight Hub reporting portal, which has a benchmark in it. And you can see that at the start of the pandemic, all file sizes sort of fell as people stopped being able to recruit. Then they pivoted towards more digital recruitment, things like that, and those numbers start to go up and up and up. And actually, a lot of people ended up with a bigger file size now than they did at the start of the pandemic. And that's some really useful contextual information to use alongside what your own sort of active file size trend would be. Gross income, as I said, leaving aside the challenges with sort of net income and ROI, so having a gross income, a quick, simple measure of how much money is being brought in. Gone for that one. And again, just as a benchmark, the charities that we're looking at currently, they're about 10% down in terms of gross income this year than where they were in 2021. I really like second gift rate as a measure. I think it's a really powerful percentage number, often time limited, so second gift within 6 months or 12 months, to say, well, how good are these people? What sort of quality of supporters are we bringing in? Are they engaged with us, or are they just there to give one gift and do something else? Was it very transactional, or are they in for the long term? So I think that can be a really powerful measure. Contactability. So because I'm doing this, I put some money into Facebook for the first time and starting to rely on that a bit more. I want to know if these people are going to opt in and am I going to be able to do things with them. So I want to include that as a benchmark. And then finally, my wildcard is legacy pledges. So I've got an established base, they're very traditional charity donors. I'm quite reliant on legacy income. So I want to check that pipeline still coming through, that I'm going to get that legacy income in the future.
Thanks, Sarge. So as a kind of counterpoint, I guess, to that, I've mocked up a charity of my own here. Before anyone puts any comments in the chat, I'd just like to reiterate I'm a data analyst, not a graphic designer, so hence my logo is rather crude, but there we go. So my example here is that I'm putting myself in the seat of being a young sort of digital first charity. I'm focusing on lots of events and digital engagement with supporters that I'm getting in, and delivering journeys to those supporters through those digital channels using automated journeys in people stage. So for my choices here, I've decided in terms of volume, I'm probably more concerned with how many people are coming on board for me on a regular basis, because I want to get a steady supply of people in and starting those automated journeys with them. I don't necessarily have a huge amount of resource at hand, so I want as much of my fundraising activity to be automated as possible. And so those new recruits coming in is important to me, as is in terms of contactability, the opt-in rate that I'm getting. So linking quite closely to the volume and also really the value metrics here. I want to devote all my time, if I can, to running those automated journeys and less on the ad hoc things like manning the phone lines or doing small scale DM campaigns that might be not particularly cost effective for me just yet. In terms of value, I've chosen LTV for this, but I'm restricting it to the first 3 years that someone's been on file with me, because I'm seeing that as a more true measure of how well my fundraising efforts are going and how well those journeys are working with the supply of supporters that are coming in. My journey metrics, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit here, but the journey metric I'm choosing here is my monthly attrition rate, because I'm not yet really established enough to be looking longer term, 3-5 years into the future. So I'm a little bit more tactical and short term in terms of what I'm doing. And so I need to know what's happening in a shorter time frame and managing things closer to the present. And then my wildcard at the bottom there is donation page visits, because again, I need to know how the value and volume metrics above, so that the new supply of supporters and the lifetime value is correlating with my web traffic. I want to get some context of whether lots of people are seeing my web page and donating or signing up or not. Because then I kind of know a little bit more about what I need to focus on, what needs improvement, and how to go about things. So before we get into some more sort of general examples, I guess anyone who's watching this webinar at the minute who's thinking, yeah, okay, I get this, but my charity doesn't necessarily have the know-how or the capacity to manage and report on our data in this way. I guess just a quick mention that Wood for Trees might be able to help you out. So please feel free to get in touch with us after this. You can find us on our website, which is on the screen snip at the bottom of the slide there, woodfortrees.net. And you can sign up to our mailing list there. There's also a contact us form there if you've got specific needs that you'd like someone from the team to get back to you and discuss with. And you can also download from there the latest State of the Sector report, which gives you an idea of how we're seeing things going across the sector. Okay, the next slide, please. We're just about to look at a couple of examples of how structured reporting can be made fairly easy with a judicious choice of KPIs like we've just gone through, and crucially, sort of building context around them. So first up here, we've got an example dashboard, and this is our Insight Hub product that we supply to a number of clients. And I think this is hopefully putting into practice the things that we've been talking about. Before I go into it in too much detail, I should mention this is based on dummy data. We're not revealing the figures of any of our clients here. But I guess starting first things first, in the top left corner, we've got a key number there. What's our income this year? The key number that we talked about earlier on. So gross income in this case. No running queries or digging out the latest management reports to get this. This is all serviced through a web browser. So just logging in and the number that you need is right there. And so we start from that point and then build around it. So underneath that income this year, we've got effectively a benchmark. We know what we raised last year, like for like, and we can compare how far along we are with that previous figure, which is great context to have. We might want to look even further into that. So to the right of those key figures there, you can see we start getting more into benchmarking and trend analysis. So at the top there, we've got the kind of speedometer type visualization of our income versus last year. And we can see that at the moment, we're currently tracking 9% behind what we finished last year on. So that gives us some kind of context immediately as to what that 27 million is like. Someone comes in and says, how much have we made this year? 27 million. Great. Is that good? Is it bad? How are things going? So we've got that context sort of built in there. Then underneath, we can look at even more into kind of the trends that we're seeing. So comparing month on month for the previous year, we can see, have we done better in January and February than we did the previous year? Maybe we did, maybe we didn't. But again, we've got that kind of benchmark there and a trend to compare what we're seeing in a bit more detail against the previous period. And the other key thing here really is definitions. So we took this screenshot a couple of weeks ago in preparing for this webinar. And in the bottom left corner, you can see of the screen there, there's a data date. And that tells us that we took this data as at the 7th of March, 2022. So when we get to comparing March versus March, we can see, oh, okay, we're tracking way behind where we were last year. What does this all mean? Are we going to catch up or not? And what that tells us is that at this point, our March data isn't yet completely mature, and we're expecting that these figures will rise. So again, we're building a bit more context around what that figure is. Now, we'd expect this report to be refreshed either monthly or weekly, depending on what our clients need, but the idea is that it's as up to date as it can be given the data that we've got. The other thing to mention just on this slide before we move on is targets. So we've not assigned a budget to this particular report, but we've got the capacity to do so. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind as well. So are we expecting that our income this year will be 50% higher than last year? Are we expecting it will be 50% lower? Again, we've got a kind of benchmark in last year's figure, but we might not necessarily want to compare what's happening this year to last year for whatever reason. So we can enter that budget figure in here to add even more context to the number. And there's an additional speedo in the top right there that would allow us to track that if we needed to do so. Then on this slide, kind of building on that, this is a slightly more complex dashboard as it's looking specifically at a regular giving program. And so we're displaying different metrics, but the principles are basically the same. So as well as our headline figures, we've built in some benchmarking and looking at previous years and trends that are fairly easy to see at a glance. And then as well as those headline figures, we've got that kind of breakdown there really quickly and easily at hand with a bunch of different filters that we can apply to drill down further and further if we need to and get more and more information out of this report. But definitions are really important here. And what we ideally want is that any staff member reading this report to understand it as well as possible. So on top of all the context that we're building around the numbers, we need to be able to see what things mean. So at the click of a button, you see the question mark button towards the bottom left of the screen there. What this does is brings up a set of tooltips that mean that anyone in our charity who's viewing the report can see very quickly how something's been defined, what it all means, what we're really talking about. And so I would always recommend that if you can structure your reporting in this way, then to do so, because it all comes back again to how things are defined and ensuring that we understand as much as possible about how we're measuring our KPIs and why we've chosen the ones that we have.
And if all else fails, just make your KPIs look as pretty as possible. That's what we can take from this slide. So this is something that a former colleague of ours, a guy called Richard Spiegel, who I'm sure you can find on LinkedIn, produced for a company he's at now. But the idea being that you would use imagery, you try and make it fun for people to take a relatively dry subject of KPIs and bring it to life a little bit. So using this graphic on the left alongside the KPIs here on the right, linking the numbers to the certain KPIs to illustrate what they mean, and then again being able to hover over these numbers to bring up definitions. You see some of the principles we've talked about with these spark lines representing the trends, the year-on-year benchmarks underneath what the current levels are. So all the sort of things we've talked about, but packaged up in a very sort of clever, fun way. So yeah, if all else fails, do something like that. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening. Hope you found it useful. Hope you got some useful sort of tips and ideas from it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now because I think that's the plan. And yeah, we'll take any sort of questions.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you very much, Andrew. Yeah, we've got plenty of questions, so I think we might as well dive in looking at the time. I'll start right from the top then. This one's from Sarah, who's asked, how do you set up the KPI report with BI or Tableau? Brackets, are you able to integrate with CRM platform and / or giving channels?
So I assume that's a question specific to Insight Hub, rather than, because I wouldn't know what data they're using. But those reports that we showed, images are all Power BI reports, and they're surfaced through an online portal. So Power BI takes the data feed from a data model, which we've created, sucks it all in, aggregates it, creates these KPIs and views, and then distributes it in a portal. And again, that's things that organizations, and we're seeing lots more organizations do. So as they start to invest in Power BI, one of the big barriers with any sort of new piece of software like that is then, well, we've got Power BI, now what do we do with it? And I think having a good data model underneath that and some clear definitions and things is going to really help that. So I'd say that's the first step. But then at that point, yeah, start visualizing things, put it into those pieces of software and start surfacing those KPIs that way.
I've just also been messaged about saying a question here that is the charity database linked to the dashboard so you're getting live data?
So again, I think that's a Insight Hub question. So yes, it is, but not sort of not live, as in if you changed it in the next 30 seconds, you'd see it. It's that it tends to get refreshed weekly. The data gets pulled straight from a charity CRM, refreshes those dashboards on a weekly basis, and then serves up a KPI in that way.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, the next one I have here, some of these questions might be a little bit tricky because they were from midway through the presentation and such, so I'm hoping that when I read them, you know exactly what I mean. So this one's from Catherine, and she's asked, how do you measure the second gift rate?
Yeah, good question. So I think time limiting it is really key. So say a second gift within 6 months and 12 months or 12 months, because that gives it a bit more meaning, gives it a bit more context around what we're looking at. So for us, it would be any supporter that we know is given and then has given a gift of any kind within that sort of next period. And you'd be looking at or hoping to get something around sort of 20-30%. Anything more than that, brilliant. Anything less than that, I guess is a bit of a worry. Obviously, it's a real relevant one for ad hoc givers, because they're the regular givers. You'd hope it's sort of up at where you want it 100% because they've signed up. But it's a really useful measure outside of that to track how those sort of ad hoc givers are performing and the quality of them. So yeah, time limiting it, say 6 or 12 months, and looking for any type of gift. The one thing I just thought is just to then be careful of what you're including in that. So something like a gift aid donation on top of a cash gift, you wouldn't want to count that as a second gift. So there are some things to sort of think about not including in that definition. But generally, sort of any sort of second gift within the time period can be a really powerful measure.
The other thing, just to jump in on that, is probably the onus is on a supporter care team to be as sure as they possibly can be that someone is a previous donor as well. It's something that we've seen previously. Duplication in transactional data can be a real pain when trying to work out a second gift rate, because if every transaction that comes in appears to be from a brand new supporter and there's not that link to someone who might have donated in the past, then that's going to hit your second gift rate as well. You're going to see a very low second gift rate compared to being able to join this latest donation with a previous one and knowing that they're the same person. That's really key to getting that second gift rate as accurate as possible.
Perfect, thank you very much. Next one I have here is how is the best way to measure effectiveness of different engagement products over a donor journey?
Oh, that's a $1 million question, isn't it? I guess it really depends on defining what each of those things is trying to achieve, and then coming up with or finding the behaviours that you can best represent that, so what those engagements are. So if it's email journeys, it could be something to do with open rates, for example, or click-through rates as open rates become less sort of reliable. But yeah, if it's email journeys, that sort of click engagement, who's reading those things, could be really powerful. If it's journeys really focused just on a financial engagement, then maybe that's a lot easier because you're just looking for those donations. Or similarly, if you're trying to get people to volunteer, essentially do those click rates in the email journeys eventually lead to a measure of volunteer hours or something like that. So I think as part of defining those journeys, those engagement journeys, setting what success looks like, and then thinking about what could be measured to create a KPI for that would be really key.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, I've got another one here from Abby. She's asking, what advice would you give to a smaller organization at the very start of their data journey? Big ideas, but tricky knowing where to start.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question. For anyone that doesn't have like a data analyst or a big analysis team, these sorts of things can be really daunting and really almost feel like a really big barrier. I think I'd start with just trying to choose some measures that you can get from your database relatively easily, that aren't going to take a day of exporting data every month from your CRM to achieve. So that could be something like gross income or new recruits within a certain period, or supporters giving within X amount of weeks. And just starting with 2 or 3 things that you can report on regularly. That idea of, if you can have some consistency, have some definitions, and start tracking things. So it promotes the use of data internally, starts getting people to bought into it, and then eventually hopefully that leads to more interest in it, more resource put behind it, and that sort of thing. But just improving then the data culture around how the organisation uses that supporter information, and starting with a few simple KPIs, I think can be a really good way to do that.
Yeah, definitely start small and get the foundations right and build up from there. So I think data quality as well can be a really big thing, particularly when you're just starting out. So knowing who someone is and having some kind of idea that they are who they say they are and they are where they say they are can be really, really helpful further down the line. So yeah, data quality I think is a big one.
Excellent, perfect. I think I got a good question to follow that up with, especially for people starting out on the journeys. Would you recommend reporting month by month or quarter by quarter? And is this dependent on the type of metric you're following?
Yeah, I think you gave us a nice get out there, Nick, and it's yeah, it's dependent on what you're measuring, whether they're sort of strategic decisions you're trying to make, in which case you might look at them less frequently. But I think monthly is a good. I think by default, I think monthly would be a good place to be. It's enough should change in a month to make them interesting, but it's not as onerous as or as difficult as trying to track things weekly, or almost pointless of tracking things daily, which can be a bit silly for these sort of big KPIs. But yeah, monthly is 12 a year. I think that's a good point to look at. I guess a lot of clients you work with, Rob, tend to do it on that sort of monthly basis.
Yeah, that's right. Again, it kind of comes back to what you do with whatever insight you get as well. So if you're taking a daily read of whichever metric, you haven't really necessarily got all that much time to do anything about it, whether it's good or bad. Whereas certainly weekly, but probably more likely monthly, you've got some kind of room then to think about what the metric is telling you, what it really means, and then deciding what to do and then how to go about it and do it properly, and what change you're expecting to then see off the back of it. So when you come back to look at the same thing the next month, you can say, right, what were we trying to change here? Did it work? Did it not? Do we need to double down on the change we've made? Do we need to change course? You know, it makes the decision-making process, I think, a bit easier when you've got a bit more room to take action and try and affect whatever you're seeing.
Yeah, I know from a personal experience with that question also, there's certain things, especially that I report on in terms of engagement, that I do monthly, but then do quarterly, because I find that certain things do change after a period of time. So it's almost worth having those to compare every now and then as well. So it could be both as well as all.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
it could be, yeah. If you're sending an email campaign out, you probably want to take results 24 hours after you've sent it to get at least an initial view that it's got to where it needs to go. But you might well not look at it again for another 7 days after that, because after that initial first few hours, you're probably not going to see that much change in your open rate compared to 7 days down the line. Whereas at some point, someone might come back to that email and click on something they didn't have time to do first time round. So yeah, a little bit a case of what are we expecting to see here, and how much time do we need to allow for that to happen.
Perfect. Yeah, I agree. So I've got another one here from Nikki. She says, hi, Rob and Andrew. Would you recommend, Abteco People Stage to develop our marketing campaigns? I hope I said that right.
Yeah, so that's a really good question as well. So People Stage is, for anyone who doesn't know, is a omnichannel way of planning communication journeys. So you might send a DM piece out and then want to follow it up with an email and plan all that journey in one place. And People Stage is great for that, compared to, say, using an ESP like Cadastra or .digital, where they're doing those journey planning, but it tends to be just email journeys. So People Stage is really powerful in that it can bring in those other channels, those other behaviors into those sort of more rounded support journeys. Obviously, it depends on the type of charity, support base. It's not going to be suitable for everyone, but we think it's a really sort of good solution, a sort of really cost-effective solution compared to some of the sort of Adobe Salesforce solutions out there, that provides a real powerful tool for quite a good value. So yeah, if you're not aware of it, it's an interesting thing to compare against, say, the sort of offerings that the ESPs do as well.
Perfect, thank you. Just a little thing to the audience here, as we've only got a few more minutes, and I've got quite a few questions here. If you'd like to upvote any of the ones you really would like answered, then we can get to those. But just one that I've got here is, would you do anything different if the charity is small, e.g. income around £200,000?
Yeah, I think where you're working with smaller numbers like that, like you might have closer relationship with supporters. Some of the KPIs that you're interested in will be different. So I know how much I said I didn't like average gift, but where you're fundraising from a small number of people and you know them very well, actually that could be a really useful thing, because you're probably not going to put any of them off, and just knowing that they're becoming more generous could be really useful. So again, I think it's about knowing what your program looks like, what what your supporters will, what's important to them, and then sort of coming up with a measure that feels like it allows you to understand them and how they're giving.
Oh, the mute button always gets me. Oh, okay. I think I've time for just one more here that's been upvoted by a few people. So, do you have any suggestions on how to increase the opt-in rates from donors for an event via Just Giving or a similar setup?
I think it's difficult because often those platforms restrict with what you can do. But I think encouraging people within their stories to talk about your organization and the cause. And I see a lot of, we've been looking at Just Giving stories recently, actually looking at the motivations behind people's stories and things like that. And the same with Facebook. I know where you plug in tools like GivePanel, which is great to enable quick fundraising, but it just then imports a very generic, where I'm raising money for Dogs Trust or whoever it might be. If you can encourage your supporters to talk a bit more passionately about the cause, why they're doing these things, I think that tends to translate better then through to sort of people understanding what they're doing, who they're raising this money for, and then why it would be important to actually maintain that conversation and why there'd be benefit to both sides to opting in. So, as I said, I think those platforms do limit what is available to people. But if you can encourage supporters as part of that sign-up process to tell a bit more about why they're doing it, that should hopefully lead to better sort of engagement across the board.
Very often there's something that I've come across anyway in terms of dealing with the charities that I deal with day after day is sometimes an element of fear around asking supporters to do things as well. And I don't think that a charity should be afraid of asking someone to opt in, to give them permission to send them emails. There are probably valid reasons why you want to do that, and it's not just to make the numbers look better. So figure out why it is you want them to do that in the first place, and sell that benefit to them. We want to communicate with you more quickly and more cost effectively. Can we do that by email? Yes, no. And no is perfectly fine. No is valid because you're keeping that supporter happy and communicating them in line with their preferences. But ask them.
Yeah, I think that was a great point there. Great. I think we probably run out of time to ask more questions. So hopefully we can get some of these to you offline to get them answered, because quite a few here actually, and some of them are really good. But I think it's probably best to wrap up now. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you so much. And thank you, Rob and Andrew. Thank you so much for that. It was really insightful. And I hope lots of people were able to learn quite a lot from that. So yeah, everybody have a lovely day. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks everyone. Yeah, thanks for attending. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you all.
Cheers.